What's up, Barnhill family, and welcome back to the channel.
Yo.
So, Nick, UFC 279 mega announcement just came out. Nate Diaz versus Khamzat Chimaev, 5-round main event. Nate Diaz said, look, make no mistake, our team asked for this fight. We weren't shying away from it. And Khamzat Chimaev says, I'm helping Dana White plan Nate Diaz's funeral.
I love it. That's some great back and forth between these two guys. There's a lot to unpack here. You know, we've got Nate Diaz saying this is the last fight on his UFC contract and the last time he's competing for the UFC. And then you've got Khamzat Chimaev, a brand new star that is seemingly just beginning his career in the UFC and is likely to have many great fights in the future. But I just feel like this is a crazy verbal agreement that we did not really see coming. I thought that Nate Diaz was going to get maybe a little bit more of a softball for his last fight, but you know, he's been a little bit of a issue as far as Dana White and feuding with the UFC as of late, and I think that this is them dealing him from the bottom of the deck. So this is a brutal last fight on your UFC career.
Yeah, I mean, kudos to Nate Diaz for accepting this fight. 5-round main event. He's going to be carrying a pay-per-view on his shoulders along with Khamzat. But I'm not so bullish on what his team said, and that is that he actually asked for this fight and was pushing for this fight rather than shying away from it. I think he would have much preferred somebody that's a little bit older, more established, and not one of these young, up-and-coming, hungry wolves that's a minus 1,100 favorite, which is exactly what Khamzat is. He's a 10-1, almost 11-1 favorite, and Nate Diaz is almost an 8-1 underdog. Nobody's given Nate much of a chance here. Listen, everybody always says if there's a 6th round in MMA, Nate Diaz doesn't lose. But I see it being very difficult for Nate Diaz to make it all 5 here. Khamzat Chimaev has got the finishing style, I think, to take Nate out of there, which is something that we very rarely see in the UFC. And given the fact that Nate wants to move into potential big boxing matches with Jake Paul and start to do things like that at the tail end of his competing career, I think a real bad loss here might tarnish that and set him back in that regard.
I totally agree. And Khamzat Chimaev is coming off of a win over Gilbert Burns.
Yeah.
That just moved him to the number 2 rank in all of the welterweight division, which is top 3 most difficult divisions in the entire world. Nate Diaz is going to feel like a light load. You know, Nate Diaz is never an easy night for somebody, but compared to Gilbert Burns, especially as of late, this seems like sort of a gimme fight for Khamzat Chimaev. And it's kind of cool that he's the hitman, so to speak, for the UFC to go take care of Nate Diaz one last time before he goes on to the boxing world or the Jake Paul business. I just feel like the fight is between Nate Diaz and Khamzat Chimaev, but the real battle is taking place between Nate Diaz and the UFC, and Khamzat is just the soldier that's going in for the UFC to take care of the business.
Dana White's the general, and Khamzat's the special forces foot soldier, so to speak.
Exactly. He's coming in to just throw a bomb on Nate Diaz's final fight in the UFC, and I can't help but think that Nate Diaz is given a lot of power here in the very last outing in the UFC. You're going to put him in at a main event against maybe the biggest up-and-comer, the biggest prospect the UFC's had in many years. You're putting him on the top of the bill. No title fights are on the line, but this is the main event, 5 rounds. Nate Diaz does have a lot of power in this scenario, and with him fighting with the UFC, I just feel like there might be something crazy take place, like Nate Diaz decides he's going to back out of this thing, not because he's scared to fight Khamzat Chimaev, but just to sort of stick it to the UFC, make their whole card seem to fall apart last minute. And I know that sounds a little bit crazy. Nate Diaz has never pulled out of fights for no reason, but when you're feuding with somebody like this and you're trying to play a chess game and you're looking at the landscape of where Jake Paul is, when he wants to fight next, maybe if I'm going to fight him, it's going to be 6 months or so down the road. I could see something crazy like that coming from the man from Stockton.
Yeah, it's a great point to make, and Nate Diaz certainly is a game fighter, and I don't think he's afraid of Khamzat Chimaev. Make no mistake about that, but Nate Diaz does wield a lot of power over the UFC at this present moment for that particular pay-per-view card because, as you said, they're building the whole card around this fight, and if he pulls from this fight, the whole card goes to hell, and I don't even know if they can hold it together as a pay-per-view. We'll have to see what else comes out and comes to pass as far as the matchmaking on that card is concerned. But getting into the actual X's and O's of the fight, let's give Nate Diaz the benefit of the doubt here and say he has some small chance to win this fight. And if that's the case, how does he get it done? Now, we did see Khamzat Chimaev get extremely tired in a 3-round fight against Gilbert Burns, and he even admitted that on the microphone. He goes, I feel a little pain and I feel a little bit tired. And that was not something that we heard out of him in any of his prior outings because they were just such flawless victories. So if Nate can drag this thing out into the later rounds, can he get Khamzat tired enough to win a couple of those later rounds, and then does a decision get close? It's so, I mean, I'm making a stretch as I'm sitting here saying it, but Nate Diaz does have great boxing. He does have good jiu-jitsu from the bottom. And I think that if he is to win this fight, it's going to have to be, he's either going to have to hurt Khamzat with something early, or he's going to have to drag this fight on into the 4th and 5th round and try to beat up on Khamzat and maybe hurt him bad like he did Leon Edwards at the end of their 5-round fight, earlier in the year. But I just don't see that happening. I really see Khamzat, he's powerful, he's young, I think his cardio will be better than it was against Gilbert Burns. I think he's addressing that. His ground and pound grappling is insane, and I don't think Nate Diaz's jiu-jitsu from the bottom is going to even remotely be able to compensate for his top pressure ground and pound.
I totally agree. And Gilbert Burns might not be the boxer that Nate Diaz is, but he certainly has the power, if not more power than Nate Diaz. And Khamzat did get cracked a couple of times, but he bounced right back. Didn't really seem to phase him all that much, even when he did get dropped and sat down and put on his knee. So I do think that Khamzat Chimaev is going to walk right through all those boxing shots. If I had to critique Nate Diaz on one thing, and it's something that everybody critiques the Diaz brothers on, it's that they don't check kicks and they just try to walk through stuff, and then they wind up falling down because they literally can't stand up anymore. And that's not a place you want to be when you're in there with Khamzat. Khamzat is a tenacious, rough around the edges fighter. He comes forward and he will attack you low, high, and center, and then he'll take the fight to the ground if he needs to. I think that Khamzat Chimaev is looking to finish Nate Diaz because he knows how difficult that is. Unless it's a doctor stoppage against Jorge Masvidal, it's been quite some time since Nate Diaz has actually been finished and a referee's had to pull somebody off of him. So I kind of see that being the way this fight takes place and ends. I think Khamzat Chimaev probably wants to test that black belt on Nate Diaz's waist, and I think Khamzat Chimaev is officially a white belt in jiu-jitsu, even though he has the skills of a black belt.
You'd hate to run into him at an IBJJF tournament as a new white belt.
Exactly, yeah. So I don't think that he's got a true black belt, so to speak, but he definitely has the skills of a black belt. And if he were able to submit Nate Diaz or choke him to sleep or something like that, it would really send Nate Diaz down the totem pole, and it would explode Khamzat Chimaev even further into the stratosphere than he already is.
Yeah, this is totally what the UFC is trying to do here. They are looking to build the star of the next generation off of the pain in the ass, thorn in the side star of this generation in Nate Diaz. And Nate Diaz is one of the biggest pay-per-view draws. I mean, listen, this could be one of the biggest as far as numbers pay-per-views of the year, and there's no title fight on the line. So I think the UFC knows exactly what they're doing here. They're trying to build a megastar out of Khamzat Chimaev. They're trying to get him to get in there and finish Nate Diaz, and then they are going to thrust him in there for a 170 title shot after that happens, if that happens. But as you said in the beginning of the video, I do think Nate Diaz wields a little bit of power over the UFC, and if he pulls from this fight, the whole card goes to hell.
Yeah, you got to incentivize Nate Diaz, because if he doesn't have pay-per-view points on this, there's not a title on the line. All of these things are basically not incentivizing him to show up, and he has the ability to ruin your entire card. I mean, they've already told us this is the main event, so that tells us that there's not going to be a title fight on this card. If there is, it's below the non-title fight.
Yeah, maybe they'll do like women's strawweight, or it'll be something like that. If they piece a title fight together, it'll be something that wouldn't necessarily draw large numbers as its own main event.
Needless to say, it would fall off big time as far as, potential biggest fight cards of the year. This would fall down way down the totem pole if Khamzat and Nate has to get pulled. And I just think that seems to be a little bit crazy for me. I don't know if the UFC realizes exactly how much power they just gave Nate Diaz doing this. But I think if they give him a little bit of points on the pay-per-view, send him out, let's just agree to part ways after this thing. Hopefully he shows up, fights Khamzat Chimaev, and for the UFC's sake, hopefully Khamzat Chimaev wins. But high risk, high reward. If Nate Diaz goes in there and beats Khamzat Chimaev, their next biggest prospect, then the money that he's going to make in his next outing, likely against Jake Paul, will just be huge.
Absolutely. Guys, drop us a comment. Is there any way Nate Diaz can win this fight, or is Khamzat Chimaev going to get in there and handle business? If you're new here, we talk all things combat sports, so if that's what you're into, we really appreciate a subscribe to the channel, a like on this video, and have a wonderful day.
Peace.